Tonight's class is going to be about prophecy. Specifically, we're going to talk about the superiority of female prophecy. There's a little bit of a preface. It's not directly linked to the Gemara, but just as a preamble, I wanted to share with you the words of the Bereshis Rabbah, the Medrash Rabbah in the 58th chapter of the book of Genesis, that comments on the beginning of the Parsha, of the Torah portion that we call Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, the first Jewish woman and our first matriarch. So Sarah lived for 100 shana, ve'esrim shana, ve'sheva shana. She lives for 100 years, and 20 years and 7 years, and there's much to be said about why it's broken up in that way, but in English we would say she lived for 127 years. So this is very meaningful for tonight's class, because tonight's class, of course, is on the Megillah, and Megillah is called Megillah Esther. It's a story of Esther, the book of Esther, and we're going to read about 7 prophetesses, and specifically, we're going to open with the prophet or prophetess Sarah Imenu. And the Gemara is going to conclude with the 7th, who is Esther. We're not going to get all the way to the 7th today. We're just going to be spending time with Sarah this evening. But I did want to share with you that the Bereshis Rabbah says, and I quote, Ma rasa Esther shetimloich al shiva ve'esrim u'mea medina. Why was it? Literally translates as, how did Esther see it fit that she should rule over 127 provinces? Okay, she didn't exactly see it fit, and that in and of itself is a discussion of the unusual verbiage of the Medrash. But at any rate, the Medrash seems to talk about the fact that Esther is probably the most powerful Jewish woman in Jewish history. We don't know of a queen who reigned over such an enormous swath of territory. There were queens in Israel, but it was a relatively small country, not nearly as small as we have today, but it was still a relatively small country. At best, you could have 12 provinces, 13 provinces. Achashverosh's empire, according to some opinions, was one of the largest empires ever in history. By contrast, the United States, which is today's superpower, has 50 states. You're talking about 127 states. It's a lot of states, a lot of provinces, a very, very diverse and enormous empire, and Esther was the queen. The most powerful Jewish monarch ever in history, one could argue. There was never a Jewish royal other than Esther ruled over such a large part of the civilized world. So how did Esther get this? And the Medrash says, Tovai Esther, Esther should come. Shahoisa bas bita shel Sarah. Esther is the direct descendant of Sarah Imenu. She's Jewish, her mother's Jewish, and her mother was Jewish all the way back to Sarah Imenu. And because she was bas bita shel Sarah Imenu, Shahoisa kuf chavzayin, Shahoisa who lived for 127 years. So that's why Esther, by virtue of Sarah's living for 127 years, has the virtue of ruling over 127 provinces. That's what the Medrash says. Now, on the surface, this Medrash does not seem to make a lot of sense. How and why would the fact that Sarah Imenu lived for 127 years influence Esther's rise to power and the notion that she was queen, a monarch of sorts, over 127 provinces? So the Rebbe spoke about this once, and I'm opening with this, and I'm also going to close with this, because you'll see that after I present the thesis that I would like to suggest tonight to understand this Gemara, I'm going to try to reconcile one of the knottiest problems in the Gemara that, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has ever fully reconciled. And I think it's because they didn't look deeply enough into the teachings of Chassidus when they were teaching this Gemara. The commentaries didn't have the teachings of Chassidus. You'll see, maybe I'm wrong, but you'll see that if you look at it through the prism of Chassidus, there may be a very, very logical explanation to a big problem, a knotty issue that we are going to encounter in this Gemara. So, beginning with this, I'm going to end with this. Let's first do the beginning. The Rebbe suggests like this. What's unique about Sarah's years was not the duration of her life. There are many people who lived long lives, especially in the biblical tradition. People lived centuries. Sarah Imenu lives a relatively short life. She dies at a very young age in comparison with most of the people at the time. Her husband Avraham lives until he's 175 years old. Her son Isaac lives until he's 180 years old. And even Jacob, who says ma'at v'royim, that his years were few and difficult and painful, also lives significantly longer. So what's so special about Sarah living, and why does the Torah emphasize these years? So Rashi says three incredible words about Sarah Imenu's years and the way that they are presented to us as Mea Shana, 100 years, Esrim Shana, 20 years, and then Sheva Shanim, 7 years. And Rashi says these words, quoting our sages. He says, quoting the Megillah and the Medrash. He says, Kulan Shavin L'Tova. All of Sarah Imenu's years were equally good. Equally good. Which, of course, on the surface, is a very strange thing to say. Because Sarah had her first and only baby when she was 90 years old. And struggling with infertility cannot be a pleasant thing. It must have been a very painful thing. And we know that Sarah Imenu was not happy. We read of narratives in Sarah Imenu's life that had to be difficult. How could she have enjoyed being abducted by the Pharaoh and held prisoner until she was released? And then it happened later with Avimelech also. That was a terrible experience, an awful experience. She brought a woman into her home and shared everything with her, and then the woman turned on her. Her name is Hagar. Sarah drives her out of the house. Sarah's angry. She's angry at Avraham. Why don't you realize and see what's going on? Why don't you do something about this? And Avraham's like, well, I'm just a husband. I don't know. I can't get involved. So Sarah has difficult days. What does it mean? Kul shavu l'teva. So the way we understand it is that for Sarah Imenu, all of her years were equally dedicated to the service of God, and as such, she found a sense of supreme satisfaction in all her years, in the rises and rests of her life, in the difficult days and in the joyful days. Sarah Imenu found the goodness in every moment. She was equipped with what we would call today night vision goggles. You know how night vision goggles work? You do, eh? I better be careful now because I forgot you're in the security.
I know them well.
Okay. So my understanding of night vision goggles, and this doesn't say in the Medrash, this is just my metaphor, is that there are small, minute amounts of light in the darkest situation, but we don't have the ability to see them. And these goggles, these glasses, are technology that multiplies light hundreds of thousands of times. So a tiny point of light when you're wearing these goggles suddenly becomes enough illumination for you to make out, am I right? Amazing. So long before the technology of night vision goggles, Sarah was outfitted by God with night vision goggles. And in the darkest hour, she could see the light. She saw silver linings. She could see how this was part of Hashem's plan. She didn't lose it. She held it together. She was composed. She had perfect faith in Hashem and could always see the brightness in the darkest of nights. And because of this, we say, Kulan Shavin L'Teva. Of course, there were differences. There were better days in Sarah's life. And there were days when she had tremendous joy and inner satisfaction. She gave birth to a little boy named Yitzchak, and his name is Laughter. And she laughed, and her husband laughed, and everybody laughed along. The whole world was laughing with them, and there was Reiv Schoik Ba'olam, like Rashi tells us, quoting our sages. Everybody was happy. Amazing miracles were brought into the world through Sarah Imenu and through the birth of her child. Obviously, those were wonderful days. But then there's the dark day when she's abducted, and she doesn't even know if she's going to see the light of day again. But Sarah Imenu lives with perfect faith, and so despite the disparate nature of her days, Kulan Shavin L'Teva, she saw everything as good. She lived with this unbelievable amount of faith in Hashem and clarity about the purpose of life. So the Rebbe, in Purim 1970, suggested like this. What do we know about the 127 provinces? There's something very interesting we know about these 120, or we learn from these 127 provinces, which we would not know otherwise. You don't know what it is? What was Achashverosh's plan? To kill the Jews. Well, Haman's plan. Achashverosh had, Haman! I don't want to deal with this. You do as you please. You take care of the Jews. And Haman made sure to send a royal edict, because he got ringed. He had the power, right? He could emboss his stamp, his seal, royal seal of approval, and he basically was all powerful in the kingdom of Achashverosh. And he sent letters to 127 provinces. What does that tell you?
It's Jewish people.
There was Jewish people living in 127 provinces. That means there was Jewish people living in India, and there was Jewish people living in China. There was Jewish people living in Ethiopia, and Jewish people living in Sudan. There were Jewish people living in Egypt, the Jewish people that were living in Afghanistan, the Jewish people that were living in Greece, and the Jewish people that were living in Macedonia. There had to be. Why would he waste the postage? It wasn't even postage. He had these runners and horses going with great haste. So clearly there was Jews in all these places. Do you think that all these Jews looked at life the same way? You think once all the Jewish people were devoted to Hashem and in love with His Torah and following everything they should do, and they had absolute unanimity, you think that? First of all, it's impossible. It's never been the case. It happened once in history, and that was the day we came to Mount Sinai, and it hasn't happened again since. Most of the other encampments were full of contention and fighting. Everybody knows the famous joke, 2 Jews, 6 opinions. It's the way it is. There's only versions of how many opinions for what amount of Jews. That's the only argument. Even that we argue about also. So this is the nature of Jewish people that we have. We're very contentious. And some of us are more religious, and some of us are less religious, and some of us are more intense, and some of us are more morose, and some of us are more joyous. We have all these different ways of doing things. Some of us are more righteous, and some of us are less. Some of us are called Pesha Yisrael, sinners of Israel, and even them, the Gemara says, are filled with mitzvahs. Packed with mitzvahs, like a pomegranate that's packed with seeds. But there are many different kinds of Jews. And we know that the Jews who lived in Shushan, they were the cosmopolitan Jews. They were very assimilated. They ended up going to a royal ball on Shabbat, where they were using vessels and artifacts from the Beit HaMikdash. And there was kosher food. There was TV dinners, but there was real food. Good food. Super good food, amazing food. And you think everybody ate TV dinners? They eventually started moving into the other areas. They didn't just stick with the kosher food. And then there was other kinds of activities that were not so kosher that were going on. And by and large, plenty of Jewish people got involved. And this is one of the reasons that the entire plan of Haman, that the genocide against the Jewish people fermented. So we know there's many different kinds of Jews. There had to be different Jews. There were blue Jews and black Jews and green Jews and yellow Jews, confused Jews, awake Jews, sleeping Jews, all kinds of Jews. You name it, we had it. However, thanks to Esther, not Mordechai, she is the architect. She is the one who puts things together, and that's going to be part of tonight's thesis. Thanks to Esther, all of the Jewish people did end up on the same page. Maybe not like it was at Har Sinai, but pretty close. In fact, when we were under the specter of direct threat of genocide in the time of Haman and Achashverosh, it says that the Jewish people, as if accepted the Torah upon themselves all over again. The closest we ever came to be Ki'ish Echad B'Lev Echad was in the time of Purim. And the Alter Rebbe says that during the time of Purim, that Kol Hayomim, and this is a quote, all the days, Shahayu Yisrael b'Sakana, that the Jewish people were in danger because of the Gzeira, the decree of Haman, that lasted for a long time. Hayukulam b'Bechinas Mesiras Nefesh. They were all at the level of willingness or readiness to lay down their lives for their religious identity. They were ready to lose their lives, but they wouldn't let go of Judaism. And it was Mesiras Nefesh, Mamish b'chol yemu b'chol eisa b'chol shah. The Alter Rebbe says, every day, every hour, every moment. Ki b'chol shah v'shah, every moment they were ready to give their lives away, lahariga, to be killed for being Jewish, v'lo laver das chas v'shalom, and not to leave their faith, their religion behind. V'le'ola al shum echad mehem machshavas chutz. Not a single Jew said, maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe we should just check out. join everybody else and be safe. And so the Rebbe suggested, now you understand what did Esther accomplish, what Sarah Imenu accomplished in the realm of time, being able to create unanimity in time where all times should be good. Esther managed to create a nefesh in the souls of the Jewish people, a unanimity of souls where everybody was, if not on the same page, and if they didn't have the same exact perspective, ultimately were ready with the same commitment, devotion, and sacrifice. So that's the 127. And the 127, the Rebbe suggests that there's a certain unanimity or bringing together of circumstances, despite the differences that we find in Sarah's lifetime, and in the duration of Esther's rule over the Jewish people as the queen of 127 provinces. So that's a nice little preface, nice little start off to our Gemara, because of course, our Gemara is going to talk about this Megillah Esther, we're going to talk about Sarah, but we're going to come back to this at the end of tonight's class. And I hope to demonstrate to you how this really is the essence of what the Gemara is telling us. But let's learn some Gemara together. So page 14, Daf Yud Daled Amud Aleph. I will refresh your memories. The Gemara said that the moment that Achashverosh royally ringed Haman, his prime minister, essentially giving him unlimited power to carry out any plan of genocide he so desired against the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, that this was more effective than hundreds of sermons and crying, lamenting prophets, exhortations, and prophetic presentations that did not move the Jewish people to tshuva, that did not inspire them in the way that the reality, the harsh reality of Haman's genocidal machinations did. That's what the Gemara says. And the Gemara told us that that ringing accomplished what 48 male prophets didn't accomplish. So we had a discussion about Hallel and Kriyas Yamsuf, and the Gemara says, can we go back to something you said before? 48 prophets? There seems to be some kind of discrepancy here. Those numbers seem to be entirely wrong, just wrong. And we have evidence of hundreds, of thousands, maybe millions of prophets. How could the Gemara make a statement? 48 prophets. So the Gemara has a discussion about prophecy. The Gemara says that prophecy existed en masse, but prophecies that were enduring, that were relevant and meaningful for posterity, that's the prophecies that were given to these 48 individuals. So now the Gemara says, all right, let's continue to look at that. Besides the 48 male prophets, you also mentioned 7 prophetesses, 7 female prophets. Let's talk about those female prophets. So the Gemara says, 7 prophets, prophetesses? Mind you mind telling me who they were? It's very curious. I would like to know who were these 7 individuals, these 7 extraordinary women. So the Gemara says, I can give you the list, no problem. Sarah, the matriarch Sarah. Miriam, this is the elder sister of Moses and Aaron. Devorah, the shofetet, the judge who led us during the early biblical times in the land of Israel. Chana, the mother of prophet Samuel, who anoints the first kings of Israel. Avigail, who we're going to hear all about later on. A woman named Huldah. And finally, Esther. There's your 7 prophetesses. That's your 7. You got Sarah, you got Miriam, Devorah, Chana, Avigail, Huldah, and Esther. And now we are going tonight to analyze Sarah. Where do you know that from? Where does it say in the scripture, and Sarah was a prophetess? Before you start searching, let me tell you that it doesn't say. It doesn't say. It does say about Miriam. It does say about some of the other prophetesses we will speak about tonight. It doesn't say it about Sarah. So the Gemara begins in its typical syntax now to quote the psukim, the verses from which we derive this notion that Sarah was a prophetess. How do we know? Sarah the Chsiv, it says about our matriarch Sarah, and this is found in the end of Parshas Noach, where we start going through the genealogy, the different generations. In the next parsha, we start off, we're going to hear about Avraham and Sarah. It says, Vayikach Avram v'Nochar lahem nashim. The pasuk says that Avraham and Nochar took wives. Avraham and Nochar are two brothers, and they married two women who we'll find out were sisters, who were also his nieces. They married their nieces. Two brothers married two nieces who were sisters. It says one's woman's name was Shem Eishes Avraham is Sarai. The Shem Eishes Nachar is Milcah. And Milcah, the pasuk says, is Bas Haran. She's the daughter of Haran. We don't know who Sarah's father is. It just says Sarah's Bas Haran. And Haran, who is Haran? He is Avi Milcah, Vavi Yiska. He's the mother of Milcah and Yiska. So let me reframe this verse for you again. We have two brothers, Avraham and Nochar, two brothers. By the way, Nochar doesn't make it. Avraham gets thrown in the fiery furnace, and then they turn to Nochar. So you believe this too? He says he saw Avraham walk out of the fiery furnace. He says, now I believe it too. Yeah, it didn't work out very well. So he got thrown in the fiery furnace, but he didn't get to walk out. He had a son, his name is Lot, and Lot's a very famous and colorful, if you will, character in the Bible, who does make some lasting contributions, and some very important people will come forth from Lot's genealogy in a very odd and strange way, but that's a subject for a different class. At any rate, these two brothers, one who doesn't make it and one who does make it, and Avraham, of course, adopts Nachar's son, because Nachar's son is actually his nephew. And it's Sarah's nephew, and it's, they're all family. And Lot looked very much like Avraham. It's the same blood, the same mix of blood. It's the same family marrying in. So you have two brothers who married two sisters. Already you have this very similar genetic pool, and they happen to be nieces of these two brothers, because they're the children of Haran. Haran is Terach's brother. So it's very similar. Lot actually looked almost exactly like Avraham. It's like identical, which was a big problem, because Lot did not have the morality of Avraham Avinu, and people got very confused. They didn't know who was who. And that's why Avraham said at some point, listen, Lot, we got to separate. You go your way, I go my way. You call me, collect when you have a problem. And he was there for his nephew. So it says that Avraham marries Sarai, and Nochar marries Milcah. It doesn't say who Sarai's father is, but it says who Milcah's father is. Milcah's Bas Haran. And then the pasuk comes back and comments, oh, by the way, this guy is Avi Milcah and Avi Yiska. Who's Yiska? Where did she come in? Who was talking about Yiska? We're talking about Sarah, and we're talking about Milcah. And we're saying, oh, Haran, you want to know who he is? He is the father of Yiska. Never heard of her. If the Torah wants to tell us who is this guy Haran, how do we identify him? How do we identify somebody who's unknown? That's the easiest way to identify. You connect him to a famous person. So a person who's well known, you say, who is this? Oh, this is the grandfather, this is the grandmother, this is the cousin of such and such. Oh, that's interesting. So we're identifying Haran by telling us that he's the father of Milcah. Okay, Milcah, she doesn't loom that large, but she figures. She's the mother of Lot. We hear of her. So Haran is Milcah's father. Oh, he's also Yiska's father. We never hear of Yiska again. This is the only time the word Yiska shows up in the actual scripture. It never shows up again. Could somebody tell me something about Yiska? Who was she? Where did she live? Who did she marry? Did she have children? We don't know anything about her. So the biblical grammar does not seem to make sense whatsoever. What is the point here? What is the point of this verse? You're telling me that he's the father of Yiska, but nobody knows who Yiska is. And anyway, how come we talked about who Milcah's father is, but we didn't talk about who Sarah's father is in the same verse? So this leads us to the conclusion that it must be that Yiska is actually a code name for Sarah. Yiska is actually Sarah. That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara comes along and says now, how do we know that Sarah was a prophetess? We know this because it says, Avi Milka v'Avi Yiska. All right. V'Amar Rabbi Yitzchak said, Yiska zu Sarah. Yiska is Sarah. If Yiska is Sarah, and Sarah is Yiska, then why don't you decide on one name for her? And anyway, if Sarah's name is Yiska, how come nobody knows that? Unless you happen to study the Rashi in the end of Parshas Noach, nobody would know who Yiska is. Who's Yiska? If I would ask you 5 minutes ago who Yiska is, you wouldn't know. Now you know who Yiska is. Now you're very educated. Now you're wise, and you know who Yiska is. What's the point? So clearly that name is revealing it, telling us something about Sarah. There's a reason that the Torah calls her Sarah, and then calls her Yiska. Yiska zu Sarah. The Gemara says, V'lama nikra shma Yiska. Good question. Funny you should ask. And why is her name Yiska? The Gemara answers, Shesachsa beruach hakodesh. Because she had far sight. She had far sight. She could see with what we call the holy presence. And because she was far-sighted, Yiska, that's why she was able to see. How does he translate it here? Far-looking. Yiska means she's far-looking. She was gifted with divine inspiration, meaning she could foretell the future. So that's why she's called Yiska. Now, incidentally, how does the word Yiska end up being far-looking? So the Siftzei Chachamim says, because the word Sacha is very similar to the Hebrew word Histaklut or Lehistakel, which means to look deeply, not just to glance, but to look deeply at something is Histaklut. So there's this verbiage which is attached to looking. Yiska, as in a verb, Yiska with a Yud, modified the Yud in front of me, she saw. She looked, but she didn't see what other people saw. She saw what nobody else saw. What would that be? She could foresee and look into the future. What do we call that? A person who could foresee the future? This is known as a prophet. In other words, Sarah is a prophetess. The Torah reveals it to us by telling us that her name is Yiska. Now, the Gemara is going to bring us another proof that Sarah is a prophetess. And then we're going to talk about why we need both proofs, which will also help us to understand and appreciate the notion of why the Torah would have called her Yiska and then called her Sarah. So the Gemara goes on to say, how do we know that she was a prophetess? How do we know that she could see what others couldn't see? So the Gemara says we know that from another verse. With regard to Sarah Imenu, it says, Shanemar, it's written, Kol asher teimer elecha Sarah, shema b'koilo. So we had a problem. The problem was that Hagar lived in the house of Avram. She got a little too smart for herself. She became arrogant. She became disrespectful. And Sarah sent her flying. And she thought that everything was finished, but an angel came back and said, no, relax. You go back home. It's going to be just fine. Submit to Sarah. Don't forget your place. It's going to be fine. And it was fine. It was fine. She behaved. And Hagar was actually a righteous woman, for the most part. And she had a baby. The baby's name is Yishmael. Now, Avram is so happy as a baby. But that's not the baby, God says. Don't be so happy with this baby. That's not the baby I promised you. You're going to have the baby. There's the baby that's going to be your child. Your child, the one who's the recipient of those blessings. Who's that child? That's Yitzchak. Okay, very nice. So the problem was that Yishmael was not so happy with his little brother. This is not so uncommon. You be an only child, you get all the attention, and all of a sudden somebody else comes into the scene, and he's getting the attention. But it was a little bit unnatural. Here we had a big 13-year-old boy. 13-year-old boys love a little brother. A little baby in the house. It's very nice. By the time this boy was 2 or 3 years old, Sarah saw that he was imperiling the future of this little boy. As we read that this fellow, Yishmael, was threatening the life of Yitzchak. And she could see from what he was doing that he was behaving in a very negative way. From the language that the Torah uses, we could derive that Yishmael had fallen into idolatry, illicit sexual relations, and even murder. Now we could see this with the way he behaved with his little brother. First of all, he started telling him about all kinds of things. You know what I read in the comics? He was telling him about, he was trying to muddle his mind with ideas that Sarah felt were totally alien to the way she was trying to raise a child. But Yishmael had ideas. He knew his grandfather was the Pharaoh, he came from a royal house, didn't know if he wanted to be so Abrahamic. He said, Akinat Nosa had some good ideas. He wasn't necessarily going along with Abraham's morality, but he was sharing this with Yitzchak. And as such, he was spoiling Yitzchak's education. Then, it seems pretty clear that Yishmael was a boy who seemed guilty of various forms of sexual abuse. And Sarah began to notice that her child might be compromised. This is the first documented case of a sex abuser thrown out as he should be. And the third thing was, he was trying to kill his little brother. Quite literally. Besides sexually abusing him, he tried to kill him. He was putting apples on his head and shooting him off with arrows, and his little boy didn't know what hit him. And Sarah saw that an accident was going to happen, and that would be the end. Sarah comes to Avram and says, out he goes with his mother. They're out, they're gone. I got a child to raise. We do not expose children to danger. But everybody knows there's many terrible stories with sexual abuse over the last few decades. The rabbis did not have the gumption and the courage and the conviction to do what had to be done. It's not a simple thing. People don't know how to deal with it. This was new in our world. It's not the first time. Avraham Avinu was the first rabbi. He didn't know how to deal with a sexual abuser. How do you deal with this kid? It's my own child. What do I do with him? But Sarah saw what Avram couldn't see. So Sarah tells Avram, get rid of him. Out. And Avram is very uncomfortable, very unhappy about this. So what does God say to Avram? God says to Avram, you better listen to your wife. Al yeda be'einecha al hanar. Don't be distressed about the boy. Ve'al amasecha and the maidservant. But instead, kol asher toimer elecha Sarah shema b'koila. Whatever Sarah tells you, you heed her voice. Why should you heed her voice? So the Gemara says, heed her voice. Shema b'koila doesn't just mean her voice. It means that you should listen to the prophetic voice of Sarah Yimenu. That is to say, the Ruach HaKodesh. As Rashi says, Shema b'koila, b'koil Ruach HaKodesh Sheba. In the voice of the Holy Spirit. She speaks with intuition that is otherworldly. She sees what you cannot. Listen to what she says. Follow her direction. And Rashi says, you gotta be kidding. Sarah saw what Avram could not? How is this possible? Was not Avram a great prophet? And Rashi says, Lo madnu, from here we can learn, Shahaya Avram tofel l'Sarah b'nevius, that Avram was secondary when it came to prophecy. Avram had virtues. In certain things he was greater than Sarah. When it came to prophecy, he was a second-rate prophet. Sarah was a greater prophet. Sarah could see what Avram could not. That's clear, because God says, listen to her voice. So the Gemara says, from this we can see that Sarah is a prophet. You see, she's a prophet because we see Yiska, Shesachsa, she can gaze, she has a far-reaching gaze, she sees what other people don't see. And it says, Kol ha-shetemir elecha Sarah shema b'koila. So from this we understand that it's b'koil ruach ha-kodesh shelo. Now, of course, you could ask the question, where do you see the word ruach ha-kodesh? It says shema b'koila. Listen to her voice. So the Maharsha says, what else should you listen to? What else can you hear besides a voice? Listen to what? Her heartbeat. It should have said, Kol masha toimar elecha, whatever Sarah says, Shema, listen. And anyway, was it the sound of Sarah's voice? It wasn't the inflection. It was what she said. Kol masha toimar, whatever she's saying. Sometimes people could say things without using words at all. How do you know somebody is unhappy about something? They're screaming in pain. They didn't have to tell you that hurts. They screamed in pain. You know what hurts. How do you know that somebody is delighted? They're laughing on top of their voice, on top of the lungs. You know they're happy about something. That would be listening to the voice, listening to inflection. But here it wasn't an inflection. Sarah wasn't making guttural sounds. She had a point. She had a conversation. Said, Avram, sit down. I got to talk to you. We got to get rid of this kid. I can't raise a Jewish child with a sex abuser, would-be murderer living in the house, who's bringing in, who knows what kind of comics and stories and messing up a kid's mind. I can't do this. And Avram's like, what am I supposed to do? Get rid of him. No, come on. Sarah, you're overreaching a little. They're both kids. They're both my children. We got to figure something out. So what does God come along and tell Sarah? You listen what she says. What kind of bekayla? Does it matter if Sarah was agitated when she said it? Does it matter if she said it with emotion or she was totally calm? Is that the point? The decibels in her voice? What's Shema B'Koila? So the Marshal says, when it says Shema B'Koila, the word koil does not mean the actual Doppler effect of Sarah's voice. That's not what it's about. It means the profundity, the prophecy, the spirituality, the vision. That's the koila. That's what you should listen to. So we see that Sarah Imenu has Ruach HaKodesh. Now the Sfas Emes asks a very interesting question. He says, if the teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak is based on the idea of Yiska, then why do we need the business of Shema B'Koila? And if it's based on Shema B'Koila, then why do we need the business of Yiska? And he says a very interesting thing. He says Shema B'Koila means that Sarah actually gave prophetic direction that we could see. She told Avram something. She said, do this, and he didn't see it. So that pasuk shows us she actually said something. But the question then becomes, was Sarah Imenu receiving prophecy on account of her husband? Or was Sarah Imenu a prophet on her own account? And the Sfas Emes says because her name was Yiska before she married Avram, that means even before she met and married her husband, she was already speaking with prophetic intuition. To the point that people around her called her Yiska. They said, oh, she's the seer. She's clairvoyant, this lady. You want to know something? This girl, she has sight. She has vision. She's the prophet amongst us. So from this we can see that Sarah Imenu was a prophet even before she was born to Avram. And with this, I'm going to introduce you to a very knotty problem, a big issue in this Gemara. A big issue. The issue is that we have clear allusion to prophecy with regard to Rachel, with regard to Leah, and even with regard to Rivka. But they're not mentioned as the 7 prophets. From Sarah, we go to Miriam. What happened to Rivka? What happened to Rachel? What happened to Leah? Rashi even quotes that medrash when he says that Rachel Imenu had a baby and she called him Yosef. I should have another son. And he says because she was a prophet and she knew there's only going to be 12 tribes. And the prophets, they follow the words of Leah and Rachel when it comes to calling the children. The names of the children are prophetically inclined. She knew who Reuven is and Shimon. We read into the name. The names are prophetically inspired. And Rashi says, Nevi'es hayu, that they were prophetesses. So why does the Gemara not mention that? Besides, the Gemara does not seem to be bothered by the fact that there were many, many female prophetesses, and they're not mentioned. In fact, there's a Medrash Rabbah in Shir HaShirim that says, Rabbi Barachia b'shem Rabbi Chelbe Amar, Kishem sha'amdu liyisrael shishim riba shal neviim, just like there were 600,000 male prophets, kach amdu lehem shishim riba shal neviim, there were 600,000 female prophets. So how'd you get with 7? When it came to 48, the Gemara poses this big question. The Gemara says 48. I got 600,000. Anybody for 700,000? You're telling me stories now. Only 48. What was the Gemara's answer? These 48 had prophecies that were enduring. Why doesn't the Gemara ask the same question here? So some of the commentaries say, well, the Gemara is just relying on what it already previously established. The Gemara said before that enduring prophecy was essentially accounted for, written, preserved for posterity, because prophetic posterity means it's a message for all generations. But the other prophecies were either for themselves or for their time. But there's a real problem with this. There's a real problem with this. The problem is, where do we see that Sarah's prophecies were more relevant than Rachel and Leah's prophecies? Shema b'koila doesn't mean listen to your wife. Sorry, ladies, that's not what it means. Shema b'koila means to listen to her prophecy. So what does that mean? In case you have a Yishmael in the house, you should have prophecy to throw him out. Where do we see that it's enduring? I would think, if you would ask me, whose prophecy was more enduring, that Rivka's prophecy is more enduring. Rivka is the one who knows that Yaakov is the man and Esau is a bum. She saw it. Yitzchak didn't see it. Rivka saw it. And Rachel and Leah's prophecies, the names of the children, he said the names of Jewish people till this very day. And we read into those names. And those names have great meaning. I would think that's very meaningful. So what does it mean? Besides, I have to tell you that many of the Mefarshim reject that approach. They reject that approach out of hand and said, you cannot suggest that the Gemara is following the same notion that it followed earlier. The Nachlas Yankov wants to claim that. Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi argues vehemently, and he says you can't say it. And he says, I don't know the answers. I don't know what to say here. We could say is Midrashas Chalukos, there are different versions in the Midrash. One version says they were prophets, one version says they weren't. It's a big problem. Because Rashi creates a seamless, unanimous tapestry of commentary. It's called Pirush Rashi. And in Pirush Rashi, he brings down Sarah Imeinu's Nevuah, both on the pasuk of Yiska and on the pasuk of Shema B'Koila, on the verse that describes the birth name of Sarah, and then the activities or the argument between Avram and Sarah. Rashi brings that. And Rashi himself says about Rachel and Nevi Yisayu. It's part of the same seamless tapestry. It's a knotty problem. And there isn't a good resolution. Those are one resolution is, the Mizrahi's resolution is, Midrashim are arguing. Midrashim are arguing. It's Midrashim that feel that there weren't any other prophets and prophetesses, that the Rivka and Rachel weren't prophetesses. Why should they be prophetesses? Why should only Sarah be a prophetess? And then we have this other medrash that seems to talk about hundreds of thousands. So Nachlas Yankov says, yeah, there you go. It's the same idea. So why was there only 7 female prophets that had a message for posterity? And what are those messages? And interestingly, Rashi doesn't list them. He lists the 48 prophets. The Gemara doesn't list the 48 prophets. Rashi lists them. And he says, I don't know who 2 of them are. And the Gemara does list the female 7 prophets. And Rashi doesn't comment and say anything like that. It's like a big problem. So, I would like to suggest a radical answer. It's a little radical because it's new, and I didn't see it anywhere. But I think that maybe this is right. Anyway, I'm going to share some Hasidic ideas with you, and we'll see if maybe this helps us. So first of all, I want to share with you a maimer from the Alter Rebbe. This is documented in a sefer called Or HaTorah, which is the Maimarim of the Tzemach Tzedek. It seems pretty sure that these 7 or 8 pages are primarily a hanocha, a manuscript that Tzemach Tzedek wrote after hearing his Zayda's Maimer, and then he added glosses. And we're not sure which was the Alter Rebbe, which is the Tzemach Tzedek, and if he wrote it at the time or wrote it later on, but it seems these are the Alter Rebbe's ideas as articulated and developed by the Tzemach Tzedek. And it's based on this very strange story in the Talmud. The story in Talmud in Masechet Bava Basra on page 58 that says about the sage whose name was Rav Bano, and he went into the cave of Machpelah and he encountered Avram and Sarah. First he says he encountered Eliezer, and there's a whole discussion about that. And then he encounters Avram and Sarah. And Avram is resting his head on Sarah's chest, and Sarah is taller, and Sarah is picking lice out of his hair. That's what the Gemara says. And the Alter Rebbe says, this makes no sense, he says. Ein lezehi hezber b'pshat klal. What does that mean? What does that mean? First of all, there were not terrestrial alive for the longest time already. For thousands of years, they'd already passed on. At least 17 centuries earlier, 18 centuries earlier. So like, what is that? Why does he have lice? Why is Sarah picking out? What does it mean? So over there in the Maimer it says like this, that this story of the Gemara is a metaphor. And it alludes to Sarah Imenu's superiority, prophetic superiority, because Avraham Avinu she was a head taller. Which is not necessarily literal, it's a euphemism, it's a representation. So Avraham Avinu's head was at the level, at the madrega of Sarah Imenu's hands. And Sarah Imenu's hands, the right hand represents the midah of chesed, and the left hand represents the midah of gevura, kindness and severity, in the Kabbalistic schematic. So this represents midot, because the hands come from the heart, they're an extension of the heart. You hug with your hands, you draw close with your hand, you push away with your hand. This represents the midot, it represents the emotional characteristics which are rooted in the heart. The mind is where intellectual creativity, development, and judgment comes from. Chachma bina das. So Avraham Avinu's Chachma bina das had to be engineered by Sarah Imenu's Chesed and Gvura. And why was this? So Alter Rebbe says because Avraham Avinu was once very lofty. His name was Avram. Avram means lofty father. And then Hashem inserts a hey. Because Avraham Avinu also has to father many other children. Av Hamoin Goyim, the father of many nations. The Hey stands for the Hamoin. All different kinds. Avraham Avinu is everybody's father. So he says Avraham Avinu is the father of all converts. Everybody who converts to the Jewish people, Avraham Avinu becomes their father. And Avraham Avinu's hand is open to embrace everybody. But Sarah Imenu is his partner, and she says, Avraham Avinu, what are you doing? This is a bad apple. You don't want this one. That's the lice. The lice represent the negative forces that Sarah Imenu is picking the lice out. Some of the greatest Jewish people have been converts. There's the Rabbi Akivas of the world. There's the Russes of the world. And then there's, the riffraff. People who never should have converted. Or people who want to convert, who we shouldn't let them convert. Because they're only making trouble. So this is Sarah Imenu. She has the superiority over Avram. And we see this from the beginning. Sarah Imenu understood that Yishmael and Hagar had to be expelled from the house. That was Sarah's M.O. That was her signature. She was there to modify Avram Avinu's weakness. Together they created a whole. So if Sarah Imenu has this superiority, and this superiority enables the concept of Avraham's being engineered and fixed through the midot of Sarah Imenu. And specifically, Sarah Imenu represents Gevura, or severity and judgment, and Sarah Imenu could pick out the lice. That's her thinking. That's one mimer. There's another mimer, and this is actually found in the Biyurei HaZoyar of the Mittel Rebbe. In the Biyurei HaZoyar of the Mittel Rebbe, he bases himself on the words that are found in Rashi, who says, Sha'avram tofel Sarah b'nevius, that Avram was secondary to Sarah in prophecy. In other words, her prophetic insight was superior to that of Avram Avinu's. So the Mittel Rebbe said that the degree of a prophet's insight or prophetic insight into the affairs of this world are commensurate with the person's engagement or involvement with the world. And the more attuned the prophecy is to what's going on around them, the greater then the degree of prophecy. Because prophecy means something it's a transmission, something being brought from a lofty level, being brought down into this world. That's the notion of prophecy. The word nevuah is about speaking, and speaking is about communication. There's ideas that are in my head, but until I speak about them, until I communicate them, until I share them, you don't know what I'm thinking. God has all these thoughts, but we don't know what God's thinking unless He tells us what He's thinking. Only if He tells us, if He communicates in a way we can understand, This is the notion of prophecy. As Rambam says in the 7th chapter of the foundational laws of Torah, foundations of Torah, when he talks about prophecy, he said the prophecy sometimes would be an image, and the prophet would see this image, and he would just know what it meant. But it's about downloading. The prophet had to download the prophecy. And because the download was an intense experience, sometimes the prophet's terrestrial reality would undergo a toxic shock of sorts, to the point that at some times we find the prophet described as a lunatic, a madman. Prophets disrobing, doing crazy things, because their entire physicality was totally knocked out as they absorbed the intensity of this divine messaging. But the thing is this: because prophecy has to be downloaded into this world, because it has to be expressed, articulated, communicated in this world, the prophet who is attuned to the world will then be able to better download the prophecy and see with greater clarity. So the Mittler Rebbe says that Avraham Avinu is in the end Avram. Hashem puts a hay into him, engages him with nations, but Avraham was aloof. And because he was detached and aloof, so therefore, he was viewing reality from a spiritual perspective. But he had a different view of reality. From the angle, from the vantage point that Avraham Avinu saw the material world, he saw it through spiritual lenses only. And because of this, he couldn't perceive Yishmael's true evil. He couldn't see it. But Avraham Avinu wanted his son Yitzchak to be killed by his older brother. He couldn't see it. He could hear no evil, see no evil. He couldn't see it. He didn't have the vision to deal with it. I was sitting at a meeting at the rabbinic committee for the kashrus. Like I live in the real world, Like I know the reality a little different than some of the other rabbanim. And they're saying, no, the guy would never do anything wrong. Like, you guys are living in La La Land. Okay? You have no clue what you're talking about. I said, you have a responsibility to the public to make sure that you eat kosher. And this attitude and approach is totally divorced from reality. So how do you know? I said, because I live in this world, that's why. I don't sit in a kollel the whole day. I walk in the real world, in the hallways of power, speaking truth to power. I know what's going on in the world. I'm sorry, guys. In the end, they agree with me. But the point is this: you need to be attuned to the world. So if you're attuned to the world, you could see the reality as it is. And if you're detached and divorced, living in some kind of ivory tower of indifference, you don't know what's going on in the world. So Avraham Avinu, he couldn't see it because Avraham Avinu wasn't involved in worldly matters. Which, by the way, is a general notion, a general commentary, as per the Zohar and the Gemara, about the difference between men and women. That a man brings one perspective, and a woman brings a different perspective. In fact, the Zohar goes so far as to say that Avraham metaphorizes the soul, and Sarah metaphorizes the body. So Sarah Imenu was totally engaged in this world. She understood. She was intuitive. She figured people out. And because that was the case, her prophetic vision was indeed superior to Avram's. Meaning her download, her ability to bring the prophetic vision into this world was by far superior. Another idea which is talked about in Likutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe says that Sarah and Avram had such an incredible spiritual level of spiritual refinement. Their achievements were so lofty that it enabled them to experience a foretaste of the Messianic era. And what will happen in the Messianic era? The Messianic era, it says that Nekeva Toseviv Gever, that the woman will become superior. The woman will dominate. That's why it says that in the Golus era is Yaakov and Rachel and Leah. Whatever you say, we'll do. And then Avraham Avinu and Sarah is the foretaste, just before the coming of Mashiach, where women are suddenly finding their voices. And then Mashiach, that's when Yitzchak becomes her father. That says Ki Ata Avinu. And Yitzchak, she runs the roost from A to Z. He wants to bless Esav. She says, yeah. You're going to bless Yaakov, and that's the way it's going to be. And Rivka determines everything. That represents the ultimate of when Mashiach will come. But Sarah and Avram are a foretaste. They're beginning to, they experience the glimmer of before Mashiach comes. And because that's the case, so it's natural that Sarah Imenu's prophecy should reign supreme. We even got a foretaste of the future where Sarah Imenu's prophecy is greater. That's basically what says in Chassidus about the prophecy of Avram and Sarah, when we contrast them, and these are the very same psukim that the Gemara brings. So, I would like to suggest something radical here. I would like to suggest to you that the Gemara, when it talks about the 7 prophetesses, is not talking simply about prophecy. It's talking about female prophecy, namely superior prophecy. The 48 prophets failed. Haman was more successful than them. His letter of genocide got them going more. That's a chiddush. That's a novelty. Wow. How sad for us. We didn't listen to the prophets, but we listened when it was a stick over our head, when there was a gun pointed at us. And the Gemara went further and said, not only was it more than the 48 prophets, but it was even more than the Sheva Nevi'os. Because female prophecy is superior. If we didn't listen to the male prophecy, at least we should have been moved by the female prophecy. And this also we didn't listen to. And that was the point of the Gemara. The Gemara comes along and says, Sheva Nevi'os man nihu. I would like to suggest to you that the Gemara is not saying who are 7 female prophets, but who are the 7 female prophets we refer to. And you can see in this first Gemara that we demonstrate the idea of Sarah Imenu's superiority in prophecy, which brings me back to the Sfas Emes, who says, why was she called Yiska? Because before she became Sarai, which is the princess of Avram, she was already Yiska. On her own right, she was a prophetess. Her prophecy was greater than Avram's. It preceded Avram and it was greater than Avram. And you're going to get to it today. We're not going to have time tonight, but we're going to go on to the next piece of Gemara. We're going to learn about the next prophet. Who is she? Miriam. Miriam's prophecy is far greater than the prophecy of her father, who's Gadol Hador. He was the leader of his generation. Moshe Rabbeinu was the first Rebbe, but he was the leader of his generation. And Amram, the great tzaddik and the great prophet. And yet, despite the fact that Amram was such a great person, we don't speak of him in prophetic terms, and we see that he's listening to his little daughter. With the emphasis on female superiority in prophecy. I think when it comes to the prophecies of Rachel and Leah, we don't see that female superiority. And Rivka doesn't speak. She just acts. So you don't see it. But with Sarah, we have the emphasis on Shema B'Koila and people listening to what she saw. It says when Rashi describes the idea of Sarah Imenu being called Yiska, so Rashi tells us that people were able to notice, people could see and appreciate what she was saying, that she was able to be a seer. I'll read to you the exact verbiage that Rashi uses. Because she was able to see, and then we're going to see that the idea is Shkulan Seichen B'Yafya, that everybody enjoyed gazing at her royal beauty, which the Gemara is going to talk about in a minute. And the fact that the Gemara brings this seems to create a seamless connection between the two ways we understand Yiska. That Yiska is not only what she saw, but what others could see about her. Like it's brought down that with regard to the notion that the prophetesses, the matriarchs, were extraordinarily beautiful. So since when is that a sign of holiness? Physical beauty is physical beauty. There are monsters that are physical beauty. So why do we talk about physical beauty? And the way it's explained in Chassidus is that the beauty of the neshamas, of the souls of the matriarchs, was so intense that it radiated outward even in the physical. So in other words, something everybody could see, because that's what the next piece of Gemara is about. The next piece of Gemara says, Davar Acher, another idea, Yiska Shakel Sachin B'Yafya. She's called Yiska because everybody enjoyed gazing at her beauty. But the funny thing is that Rashi gives us a third interpretation. He said Yiska Lashon Nesichos. Yiska also means that she was a princess. K'may Sarah Lashon Srara, like the word princess, which indicates some kind of royal superiority or royal dominion. The Gemara doesn't mention that here. The Gemara doesn't bring the third thing because that's already connected to Avraham. Sarai, she was his princess. The Gemara brings a second because everybody could see her beauty. And now once again, I'd like to take a little of a leap and suggest to you that the seeing of her beauty is directly linked to her vision of prophecy. People could see her beauty means they saw her physical beauty. They could see that she radiated with holiness. That's what they could see it. They could see the beauty on every level. This is something they could see. Not something she was, but something they could see. In that case, we're talking here now not about women who were also prophets who God spoke to, but the female superiority insofar as prophecy is concerned. And that's the chiddush, that's the novelty of the Gemara that says that this business of Vayasar HaMelech Tabatei, that Gdoila Hasaras Tabas, the removing of the ring, was greater than Abba V'Shmein Neviim, V'Sheven Nevi'es, and 7 prophetesses. Because their prophecy should have been brought down into real time, and it was. And yet, it still didn't accomplish and achieve what it should have accomplished. But when Haman got that ring, everything turned around. Anyway, so that's how do we end where we began? I promised you end where we began, but this is the point. This is the point. That Sari Menu Kulam Shavan Lateva. Sari Menu had the ability to see things in this world. In this world she saw the light. It doesn't say everybody else is cool. It says Sarah was cool in Shavan Lateva. That was Sarah's gift. Sarah could see it in this world. And it goes to the 7th prophetess, Esther's prophecy, who once again could see how the Jewish people would rise to the occasion in this world. Mordechai didn't have the vision Esther had. He didn't believe it would work. Sarah saw how it could be brought down into this world, and Esther, and therefore there's a direct link, as the Rebbe explains, the link between Esther and between Sarah, the Kul and Shavan Lateva, both had the ability. Sarah had the ability to see in every frame of time the light, and Esther had the ability to see the light in every soul, knowing that it could be reached. Both of these represent the notion of the female superiority insofar as prophecy is concerned. This is only the first of a volley of classes that are focused on female prophecy, as the next we'll talk about Bezrat Hashem, the elder sister of Aaron and Moshe Rabbeinu, Miriam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.